Hello, welcome to our webinar for Anne Arundel County Public Schools, addressing significant disproportionality. This is the first in a series offered by the district covering this topic. In this webinar, we will focus on what significant disproportionality is and why it is important to understand the nuances and make plans to resolve your disproportionate data. This webinar series is designed to help you understand significant disproportionality and identifying potential causes, develop the leadership systems and competencies needed to address significant disproportionality, conduct a root cause analysis, and create an action plan for addressing significant disproportionality. Additionally, this series will support your understanding of how to prevent disproportionality through programmatic infrastructure and professional development. Today, we will focus on identification and placement. Who is AIR? We are a nonprofit research and technical assistance organization working to solve many of the urgent challenges in the U.S. and around the world. As an organization, our work extends from expertise assistance, transforming systems, to resource development. In 2021, AIR launched an equity initiative, an investment in research and the technical assistance to address systemic inequity. We have worked with districts across the country in the areas of special education, MTSS, and significant disproportionality. AIR has partnered with district leadership and the CCEIS committee at AACPS, specifically to address identified areas of disproportionate disciplining and identification of Black and Brown students with disabilities. We applaud the efforts of AACPS in prioritizing this issue and moving in a positive direction towards inclusive learning environments for all students. Let's take a look at our approach to this partnership with AACPS. Step 1 of this process involves partnering with district leadership and participating in CCEIS meetings. During Step 2, we work to define the problem and understand the root cause. This involves collecting data and completing an analysis to identify areas contributing to disproportionate identification and discipline of Black and Brown students with disabilities. In Step 3 of our partnership, we work to create an action plan and prepare for implementation of the plan within the district. This involves creating comprehensive communication plans and developing professional development opportunities. Finally, in Step 4, we work to refine this process and measure the impact, proposing adjustments where needed and making further recommendations. Next, let's unpack this term, significant disproportionality. What is your understanding of the term significant disproportionality? Please take a few brief moments to record your thoughts in your handout. Let's take 15 more seconds. Thank you for engaging in that. You all know a lot about significant disproportionality already. Here is our official definition of the term. Significant disproportionality refers to when students of any racial or ethnic group are identified for special education, placed in more restrictive settings, or disciplined at higher rates than their peers in other racial ethnic groups. IDEA requires states to use a standard methodology when analyzing representation by racial and ethnic subgroups in the identification, placement, or discipline of children with disabilities. This standard methodology requires states to use risk ratios to analyze the disparities by race in the identification, placement, or discipline of students with disabilities, and to set a threshold or cut score above which the difference is considered significant. Although the regulations of IDEA identify significant disproportionality based on overrepresentation, it is recognized that overrepresentation may in fact be due to the under-identification of other racial or ethnic groups. Take a moment to reflect. How is this the same or different from your definition? Addressing disproportionality requires that we not only understand it and its context, but that we regularly ensure proactive measures are in place.
Disproportionality is rooted in inequity. The term equity refers to fairness and justice and is distinguished from equality. Whereas equality means providing the same to all, equity means recognizing that we do not all start from the same place and must acknowledge and adjust for the imbalances. The process is ongoing, requiring us to identify and overcome intentional and unintentional barriers arising from bias or systemic structures. Let's take a look at the photo. At the top, we have a representation of inequality. This photo represents inequality as the tree is sort of leaning towards the left, making it potentially easier for the child on the left to get an apple. Additionally, we notice on the tree there are more apples on the left than the right. The next picture we see represents equality, as both children are offered the same ladder to reach their apples. Ultimately, though, this provides insufficient for the child on the right and maybe overly compensates for the child on the left. Finally, we have a representation of equity in the third picture. The child on the right has a slightly larger ladder because that's what they need to access the apples. Let's take a moment to reflect. Recording your participant guide, a practice in your LEA or district that could be considered more equal than equitable, even with the best intentions. How could that practice be improved to provide equitable access for students? You have 30 seconds. About 15 seconds. Thank you for engaging in that activity.
Let's take a look at the definition of disproportionality under the law. IDEA 2004 Indicator 9 states percent of districts with disproportionate representation of racial and ethnic groups in special education and related services that is a result of inappropriate identification. Section 618 requires states to collect and examine data to determine if significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring in the state and the local education agencies of the state with respect to the identification of children as children with disabilities, including the identification of children by particular disability, the placement in particular educational settings of such children, and the incidence, duration, and type of disciplinary actions, including suspensions and expulsions. Now that we have a better understanding of how the law defines disproportionality, we want to make sure that we are engaging in proactive measures. Districts and schools should engage in robust data collection and use that analysis to plan for these proactive measures. Data analysis conducted must be through the lens of student demographics to include those areas of race, gender, and disability category. School leadership must ensure programmatic infrastructure includes tiered intervention supports and differentiated learning opportunities, providing accessibility for all learners. Implementation fidelity and a well-established routine for data analysis is vital to the success of this endeavor. As you complete your data analysis, you and your team are able to synthesize a problem statement, such as the one above. You are able to say that in a given LEA, which students are how many times likely than their peers to be considered disabled, to be disciplined at a higher rate, or to be placed in more restrictive settings. Let's go into significant disproportionality further. We're going to explore how disproportionality can show up in identification versus representation. Let's look at disproportionality in identification. Identification. The result of a multi-step process that determines whether a child has a disability as defined by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and needs special education services as a child with a disability. Over-identification. The inappropriate identification of a child who does not actually have the identified disability and who does not need special education services as a child with a disability. The term also can be applied to a group of children. Under-identification. The failure to appropriately identify a child who has a disability and needs special education services as a child with a disability. The term also can be applied to a group of children. Now let's take a look at disproportionality in representation. Representation refers to the rate at which children from a particular racial or ethnic group are identified as children with disabilities or as children with specific disabilities as determined by a mathematical formula. Overrepresentation. When children from a particular racial or ethnic group have a higher risk of being identified as children with disabilities or as children with specific disabilities as compared to children not in that particular racial or ethnic group. Underrepresentation. When children from a particular racial or ethnic group have a lower risk of being identified as children with disabilities or as children with specific disabilities as compared to children not in that particular racial or ethnic group. Let's explore this further. Here are some examples of disproportionality from research. Black students are identified for special education at higher rates than peers and more likely to be identified with intellectual disabilities and emotional disorders. Asian students are underrepresented in special education overall, but are often overrepresented in the category of autism. Let's review the issues and challenges that can lead a district or LEA to disproportionality in identification. Poorly established pre-referral process. Potentially, there are point persons responsible for overusing the process. Your child's study teams are not doing the best at evaluating progress of students. Potentially, you have a lack of implementation fidelity on your tiered intervention program. There's not enough data collection and analysis. There's inconsistent implementation of the interventions themselves. Finally, practices that do not account for the cultural and linguistic differences of your student population. Lack of systems to support your emergent bilingual learners. Lack of culturally responsive instruction. And poor family and community engagement opportunities. Let's take a moment to review placement regarding significant disproportionality. Disproportionality in placement or the least restrictive environment. Just as the law does not define special education as a place, but rather the configuration of services and supports as defined in a student's IEP, inclusion is not a place, but rather a systemic approach to uniquely addressing student learning and social engagement within the same instructional frameworks and settings designed for the whole school community. Let's keep that in mind as we move forward. Least restrictive environment. Students with disabilities should be educated in general education classrooms to the maximum extent that is appropriate. Districts are charged with providing a continuum of services for students with disabilities to meet their individual needs within these settings. Disproportionality in placement occurs when students receive special education services in more restrictive settings at a higher rate than their peers with disabilities from other races and ethnicities. Let's look at some data. Black boys transfer to alternative schools at higher rates for disciplinary reasons. Black and Hispanic boys attended alternative schools in greater proportion than they attended public schools. Black boys accounted for 8% of regular public high school students, but account for 16% of alternative school students. Let's look at the impact of restrictive placement decisions. The degree to which students with disabilities are included in classrooms with their non-disabled peers is substantially related to performance on the statewide assessment. And in this study, they did control for a host of relevant variables such as income, race, and English language proficiency. Now let's explore the issues and challenges that can lead to disproportionality in placement. Potentially, your district or LEA has a lack of implementation fidelity of the student's IEPs and behavior plans. Potentially, those plans don't meet students' needs in an individualized manner. Lack of support and development for all teachers to support with the implementation could be the concern. Another challenge is lack of equitable resources or alternative supports within the least restrictive environment. Potentially, you have concerns around an inadequate allocation of resource identification and allocation to support a variety of student needs. Finally, let's explore discipline related to significant disproportionality. Disproportionality in discipline. When students in one racial or ethnic group are subjected to disciplinary actions at higher rates than their peers. This can look like in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, alternative placements, expulsion, school-related arrests, referrals to outside law enforcement, and longer suspensions for similar infractions. Unequal treatment can start at a young age, starting in preschool. Children as young as 3 and 4 have been suspended and expelled from school, a pattern that can continue throughout a child's education. Black students, boys, and students with disabilities were disproportionately disciplined. These disparities were widespread and persisted regardless of the type of disciplinary action, level of school poverty, or type of public school attended. Let's review the impact of this disproportionate discipline. Students who are suspended or expelled are more likely to repeat a grade, less likely to graduate, and more likely to become involved in the juvenile justice system. Students with disabilities, and in particular students of color with disabilities, are disciplined at higher rates than their non-disabled peers. Let's review the issues or challenges that are causing the disproportionality in discipline. Potentially, there is a lack of disability awareness, lack of systems to support students with significant behavioral needs, lack of implementation fidelity of behavior plans. Potentially, those plans don't meet the student's needs in an individualized manner. Lack of support and development for teachers to support with implementation. Potentially in your district, there's a lack of differentiation in the discipline continuum for students with disabilities. The students with behavioral challenges are held accountable to the same expectations as those without behavioral disabilities. Let's review some common myths and misconceptions that you may hear in your district or LEA. Our data will not change because our students just have behaviors. There's nothing more we can do. Consider whether this is a myth or a misconception. In fact, it is a misconception. Yes, all our students come with behaviors, and those behaviors indicate needs and growth areas. There's absolutely everything that we can do through mitigation efforts and intervention to teach them those missing skills. Students with severe behavioral and academic needs automatically need full-time restrictive placements to meet their needs. Consider whether you think this is a myth or a misconception. We would call this a myth. While there are some students who qualify for those high supportive placements, there are others who can certainly be supported in inclusive settings with the right accommodations. We use our MTSS process to help identify students who need evaluations. That's why our identification numbers are so high. This is certainly a common misconception. MTSS is not meant to be the vehicle to get students to a special education evaluation. Students with behavioral disabilities require more punitive consequences to support increase in preferred behaviors, regardless of disability. This is quite a popular myth. We do understand from research that students' behaviors change with positive reinforcement. Our teachers have already been through Equity PD. We don't have those concerns here. This is another common misconception. We understand the work of equity and professional development to be ongoing. We've now had an opportunity to understand disproportionality and understand some of the causes. More importantly, we've spent some time discussing the impact on our students. Why does this matter? Please take a moment to reflect on this question in your handout. You will have 30 seconds. About 10 seconds left. Thank you. Addressing significant disproportionality in special education is more than a compliance issue required by law. We want all students to have access to high-quality curriculum, high expectations, engaging and rich learning experiences, and positive educational experiences that set them up for success in their lives outside of school. When we as adults in education misidentify students as needing special education, place them in restrictive settings, or discipline them more harshly, we are limiting them from reaching their potential. What do you think about this quote? How does this relate to what we've been discussing and the data we just saw? We can, whenever and wherever we choose, successfully teach all children whose schooling is of interest to us. We already know more than we need to do that. Whether or not we do it must finally depend on how we feel about the fact that we haven't so far. As we examine the variety of factors that contribute to disproportionality, it is important to approach this work with a mindset that there is not one overriding cause to pinpoint. This is the case with complex problems. If there were one standard cause, the solution would be easy to remedy. Often, it is a confluence of factors. Approaching these kinds of complex problems requires a mindset of curiosity, a willingness to dig deeper, question our assumptions, and not settle for quick fixes that do not address systemic causes. Keep this in mind as we go through this section. As we mentioned on the slide before, there is not one single factor that contributes to disproportionality. Each district is unique, and each LEA within is unique. However, we can capture some common trends. Let's review these together. Reflect on whether or not these factors feel relevant to your school or district. Lack of or inconsistent application of tiered intervention systems, inclusive practices, and culturally relevant teaching. Lack of access to scientifically based instruction. Economic, cultural, or linguistic barriers to appropriate identification or placement. Inappropriate use of disciplinary removals. Lack of access to appropriate diagnostic screenings. Differences in academic achievement levels. Other similar policies, practices, or procedures that contribute to disproportionality. If we truly want to change outcomes for our students, we will need to change policies, procedures, and practices to specifically address significant disproportionality. Changing special education policies and procedures and practices to address issues of disproportionality will require intentional planning and design. Today is the first in a series of 4 workshops designed to help you and your team address significant disproportionality. Workshops 2 through 4 will be held in March and April. We hope you and your team will join us for all the workshops in this series. Each session is designed to build knowledge and skills that will continue with an action planning session to set you up for success. Participants will also be presented with strategies for more proactive measures to prevent significant disproportionality when we cover the initiatives, professional development, and necessary programming. Slides and materials from today's session and all future sessions will be available in Moodle. We also invite you to join us in the community of practice that is specifically designed for LEAs designated as SD1 and SD2. Here you will be able to learn from experts in the field, hear from LEA colleagues from across the state who have successfully navigated their way out of SD, and engage with others who are grappling with some of the same issues as you. We will have the COP dates and registration information posted before the next workshop. Thank you for engaging today. Goodbye.